The grand ballroom of the royal palace glittered beneath crystal chandeliers as nobles gathered for the annual harvest banquet, eager to celebrate another prosperous year beneath the king's blessing. Laughter floated through the hall, silver goblets clinked together, and musicians filled the room with graceful melodies. Yet every conversation paused whenever Duke Leopold Kingsley entered. At only 25, he was already one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the kingdom, but his reputation was wrapped in silence rather than charm. Tall, impeccably dressed, and strikingly handsome, he carried himself with calm dignity that many mistook for arrogance. Few knew that behind his reserved expression lived a man who had buried his parents, endured betrayal from trusted allies, and learned to expect loneliness instead of loyalty. Leopold greeted the king with respectful composure before taking his assigned seat among the highest-ranking nobles. Around him, whisper conversations resumed. Some admired his achievements, while others quietly calculated how much of his vast fortune could become theirs if fate turned against him. His uncle Lord Alistair Kingsley smiled across the table with practiced warmth, though the ambition hidden behind his eyes was colder than winter steel. Leopold noticed the smile but ignored it. Years of disappointment had taught him that suspicion was often wiser than trust. As servants carried golden platters from table to table, Leopold suddenly pressed a hand against his chest. A sharp pain spread through him like fire beneath his ribs. He struggled to breathe, lifted his wineglass, then froze as violent coughing overtook him. Crimson drops splattered across the white tablecloth. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. The musicians stopped playing, conversations died instantly, and nobles rose from their seats in horror as the Duke collapsed onto the polished marble floor. The royal physician hurried forward while servants cleared the crowd away. After a tense examination, Leopold was carried to a private chamber within the palace. Hours passed before the physician emerged, his face pale with regret. Speaking first to the king and then to the gathered nobles, he announced that the Duke suffered from a rare illness that had weakened his heart beyond recovery. Despite every treatment known to medicine, Leopold had no more than 10 months left to live. Silence settled over the palace like heavy snowfall. Before dawn, the devastating news had spread beyond the capital, traveling from noble estates to village marketplaces until the entire kingdom mourned the man many believed had been condemned by fate itself. Not everyone grieved. Hidden behind closed doors, Leopold's relatives quietly celebrated the physician's prediction. His uncle began discussing inheritance laws with lawyers before the sun had fully risen. Cousins who had scarcely visited in years suddenly expressed interest in the duchy's affairs. Greedy nobles exchanged secret letters proposing alliances that would divide Leopold's lands after his death. To them, 10 months was not a tragedy but an opportunity. Leopold returned to Kingsley Castle carrying the burden of his diagnosis with remarkable calm. He summoned his oldest advisor and admitted that his greatest fear was not dying but leaving thousands of loyal servants and villagers vulnerable to ruthless relatives. Without a lawful duchess to inherit alongside him, the estate could be torn apart by endless disputes. Reluctantly, he decided to seek a wife, not for companionship but to protect everyone depending upon his name. Across the countryside, Serafina Everly spent her mornings treating sick children inside a humble cottage that served as both home and clinic. At 23, she possessed gentle manners shaped by noble upbringing, though little remained of her family's former wealth. After her father's death defending innocent villagers from corrupt officials, creditors had seized the Everly estate, leaving Serafina and her widowed mother to survive through honest work. Rather than surrender to bitterness, she devoted herself to studying herbs, medicine, and practical estate management, believing kindness carried greater value than titles ever could. Villagers admired her courage because she never refused anyone in need, whether they could pay or not. When news spread that Duke Leopold sought a bride despite his fatal illness, noble families laughed behind jeweled fans. One by one, wealthy young women declined the proposal through carefully written letters, unwilling to marry a man expected to die within the year. Serafina listened quietly as neighbors discussed the matter with pity and disbelief. Instead of hearing a doomed nobleman, she heard the story of someone abandoned precisely when compassion mattered most. After thoughtful reflection and her mother's gentle blessing, she accepted the invitation to meet the Duke. Their first meeting took place in the castle library, where shelves overflowing with books softened the imposing atmosphere. Leopold expected another reluctant candidate hiding disappointment behind polite smiles. Instead, Serafina greeted him with steady eyes and sincere warmth. She asked nothing about his fortune or titles. She simply inquired whether he had eaten since leaving the palace, because grief often stole a person's appetite. The unexpected question left him speechless. Weeks later, they married in a quiet chapel surrounded by loyal servants rather than ambitious nobles. That evening, standing awkwardly in their candlelit chamber, Leopold finally whispered, "The doctor gave me 10 months." Serafina crossed the room without hesitation, gently held his trembling hands, and answered, "Then every sunrise belongs to us. I'll love you for 10 months, and if heaven grants us another day, I'll love you then too." For the first time since losing his parents, tears escaped Leopold's eyes. As she embraced him, Serafina caught the faint, bitter scent lingering on the medicine bottle resting beside his bed, and a single troubling thought quietly settled into her heart. Morning sunlight poured through the towering windows of Kingsley Castle, but its warmth struggled to reach the hearts of those living inside. Although Serafina had been Duchess for only a few weeks, she quickly realized the grand halls concealed more sorrow than splendor. Servants lowered their voices whenever senior officials approached, children of castle workers avoided eye contact, and fear lingered in every corridor like an unwelcome guest. Leopold noticed her growing concern but said little, believing some wounds were too deeply rooted to heal before his remaining time slipped away. Each morning, Serafina prepared Leopold's medicine herself before watching him drink it. She carefully noted every symptom that followed. His fever appeared without warning, vanished just as quickly, and returned on different days with no clear pattern. His heartbeat weakened after taking the medicine rather than before it, and the bitter scent she had noticed on their wedding night never faded. Years spent studying herbs among village healers had taught her that illnesses followed natural rhythms, yet Leopold's condition seemed to obey something far more deliberate. She quietly collected tiny samples from each bottle, hiding them inside small glass vials beneath her dressing table. As Serafina explored the estate, she encountered the harsh reality hidden beneath its polished reputation. One afternoon, a frightened maid accidentally dropped a silver teapot while serving Lord Alistair during luncheon. Before anyone could react, the head steward raised a leather whip and struck the young woman across the shoulders. She collapsed in pain, apologizing through tears while nearby servants stared helplessly at the floor. Without hesitation, Serafina stepped between them and spread her arms protectively over the trembling maid. The next crack of the whip landed across the Duchess's sleeve instead. The room fell silent. At that very moment, Leopold entered after hearing the commotion. His pale face darkened with controlled fury as he strode forward and caught the whip before it could fall again. The braided leather sliced across his bare palm, drawing blood, yet he never loosened his grip. Looking directly at the steward, he ordered every abusive overseer dismissed before sunset and commanded that the injured maid receive proper treatment with full wages. His voice remained calm, making the judgment even more terrifying than a shout. The steward was escorted from the castle while every servant watched in astonishment. That evening, Leopold quietly apologized for exposing Serafina to such cruelty. She gently cleaned the wound on his bleeding hand and replied that protecting people was never a mistake. Her words settled deep within him, awakening the compassionate leader he had hidden beneath years of grief. The following week, he personally reviewed complaints that had been ignored for years. Corrupt tax collectors were removed from office, elderly servants received pensions instead of dismissal, and shipments of grain were sent to villages suffering from hunger after excessive taxation. News of the Duke's decisions spread rapidly across the duchy, surprising people who had long believed kindness no longer existed within noble walls. Serafina spent her afternoons visiting nearby villages rather than remaining inside luxurious chambers. She treated sick children without payment, organized supplies for struggling families, and listened carefully to the concerns of ordinary people. Everywhere she traveled, villagers spoke of mysterious disappearances among orphan children who had supposedly been sent away for work. Others described impossible taxes demanded by local officials who claimed to act under noble authority. Every story strengthened her suspicion that corruption stretched far beyond a handful of cruel servants. Watching Serafina devote herself to strangers slowly transformed Leopold's understanding of love. He had expected gratitude for offering her a title, yet she offered something infinitely greater by restoring hope to places he had forgotten. Inspired by her example, he ordered the construction of the duchy's first free hospital on land overlooking the river. When his advisors questioned the enormous expense, he answered simply, "A kingdom grows stronger when its weakest people are cared for." Serafina smiled quietly because she recognized those words as the promise she had once whispered to him during an evening walk. Their affection deepened through quiet moments untouched by ceremony. On a rainy night, Serafina remained in the library organizing medical books until exhaustion overcame her. Leopold found her asleep at the table with ink still staining her fingertips. He gently lifted her into his arms and carried her through the silent corridors toward their chamber. Half awake, she instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck and murmured, "Don't disappear." The fragile plea pierced his heart more deeply than any diagnosis ever had. After laying her carefully upon the bed, he sat beside her until dawn, holding her hand while listening to the peaceful rhythm of her breathing. Several days later, they planted white rose bushes together in the neglected castle gardens. Leopold admitted he had avoided growing flowers because everything he loved seemed destined to vanish. Serafina pressed fresh soil around a young rose and smiled gently. "Flowers bloom because they are cared for, not because tomorrow is guaranteed," she said. For the first time since receiving his diagnosis, Leopold allowed himself to imagine a future extending beyond measured months. Late that evening, after everyone else had retired, Serafina returned to her hidden collection of medicine samples. Serafina spent the following days hiding her discovery behind a calm smile while quietly gathering proof. Revealing the poison without undeniable evidence would only warn the culprit and place Leopold in greater danger. Each morning she secretly replaced a portion of his medicine with harmless herbs, carefully preserving the original liquid inside sealed bottles. To her relief, his coughing became slightly less severe, confirming what her instincts had already declared. Someone had disguised murder as illness, and that someone possessed enough influence to deceive the entire kingdom. Leopold noticed the small improvement in his strength but dismissed it as chance. He remained focused on governing the duchy with renewed determination, refusing to waste whatever time remained. Together, he and Serafina visited villages damaged by years of corruption, restoring abandoned mills, reopening schools, and ensuring fair distribution of grain. The people who once feared approaching their duke now greeted him with grateful smiles. Watching children laugh as Leopold knelt to speak with them revealed a side of him hidden beneath years of grief. Serafina realized his greatest sorrow was not dying but believing he had lived without leaving kindness behind. While examining old financial ledgers inside the castle archives, Serafina discovered payments made to the royal physician over several years, far exceeding his official salary. The records bore no explanation, only a private seal belonging to Leopold's household. She traced additional transactions leading to merchants who had supplied rare medicinal ingredients never listed in the castle pharmacy. Every clue pointed toward careful planning rather than coincidence. Before she could copy every document, footsteps echoed outside the archive. She concealed the ledgers beneath her cloak and slipped away moments before unfamiliar guards entered to inspect the room. Determined to confront the physician privately, Serafina traveled to the capital under the pretense of purchasing medical supplies. The aging doctor welcomed her with nervous courtesy, but his confidence crumbled when she placed one of the poison bottles before him. Tears filled his eyes as he admitted that someone had forced him to falsify Leopold's diagnosis years earlier. Before he could reveal the mastermind's name, an arrow shattered the window and struck him through the chest. He collapsed into Serafina's arms, struggling for breath. With his final strength, he whispered, "Do not trust his godfather." Moments later, he died, leaving behind only silence and unanswered questions. The revelation struck Leopold like another fatal wound. His godfather, Lord Cedric Ashcombe, had raised him after his parents' deaths, taught him statecraft, and stood beside him during every public ceremony. Leopold refused to believe such betrayal was possible, yet the evidence growing around them became impossible to ignore. Together they secretly searched records connected to Cedric's estates and uncovered hidden correspondence proving he had orchestrated the seizure of Serafina's family lands, manipulated tax collectors, bribed officials, and slowly poisoned Leopold to inherit the kingly fortune once the Duke died without heirs. The man Leopold loved as family had patiently destroyed every source of happiness in his life. Knowing they had uncovered the truth, Cedric abandoned secrecy. One evening, masked riders ambushed Serafina's carriage while she returned from visiting the new hospital. Her guards fought bravely but were overwhelmed. She was blindfolded and taken to an abandoned monastery deep within the forest, where old stone walls concealed stacks of timber soaked in oil. Bound to a wooden pillar, she realized the building had been prepared to burn, erasing both evidence and witness alike. Though fear tightened around her heart, she refused to surrender hope, believing Leopold would never stop searching. When Serafina failed to return before nightfall, Leopold ignored every advisor urging patience. Gathering only 12 knights whose loyalty had never wavered, he rode through relentless rain toward the monastery identified by a surviving guard. Flames already climbed the ancient walls when they arrived. Steel clashed against steel as Leopold led the charge, cutting through mercenaries with desperate determination. Inside the blazing sanctuary, he found Serafina struggling against her restraints while smoke swallowed the room. Without hesitation he severed the ropes, wrapped his cloak around her shoulders, and carried her through collapsing beams. Burning timber crashed across his back before his knights pulled them both into the open air. Neither spoke during the ride home. Serafina carefully treated the burns covering Leopold's shoulders while he watched her trembling hands. He finally admitted that losing her had terrified him far more than death itself. She answered by resting her forehead against his, needing no grand declaration to express what both already understood. Their silence held more truth than any spoken confession. Only days later, Cedric made another attempt. Bandits attacked the couple while they crossed a narrow mountain pass on their way to present evidence before the king. Arrows darkened the sky as frightened horses reared toward the edge of a crumbling bridge. Leopold struggled to control the carriage after reopening his injuries, so Serafina seized the reins and urged the horses forward with fearless precision. The bridge groaned beneath them, wooden planks splintered into the roaring river below, and for one impossible heartbeat the carriage seemed suspended above empty air. Then the horses reached solid ground just as the bridge collapsed behind them, leaving their pursuers stranded on the opposite side. Safe for the moment, Leopold suddenly doubled over, coughing blood more heavily than ever before. The poison had continued damaging his heart despite every effort to slow its progress. As Serafina held him beneath the fading evening light, she realized exposing the conspiracy alone would not save the man she loved. Somewhere, beyond every known remedy, a cure still had to exist, and she silently vowed to find it before time finally defeated them. The royal physicians examined Leopold for hours after their return to the castle, but every face carried the same defeated expression. The poison had weakened his heart for too many years, leaving scars no ordinary remedy could erase. Although removing the tainted medicine had slowed the damage, they estimated he had little more than a month remaining. Their words spread through the castle with crushing speed. Servants lowered black ribbons over portraits, villagers gathered outside the chapel to pray, and the unfinished hospital continued rising stone by stone because every worker refused to let the Duke's final dream remain incomplete. Leopold accepted the verdict with remarkable calm. Instead of retreating into despair, he spent each morning reviewing petitions, signing land reforms, and visiting the people whose lives he had begun changing alongside Serafina. He spoke with farmers rebuilding neglected fields, laughed with children attending reopened schools, and quietly thanked elderly servants who had remained loyal through every hardship. Watching him devote his fading strength to others only deepened Serafina's determination. She refused to believe that a man who had finally learned how to live deserved so little time to enjoy it. Without telling anyone, Leopold began writing letters late each night after Serafina had fallen asleep. One by one, he filled elegant envelopes with memories, advice, and promises meant for the days after his death. Some letters were addressed to anniversaries he believed he would never celebrate. Others encouraged Serafina to continue building hospitals, planting gardens, and opening schools across the duchy. Several contained nothing more than simple reminders to smile whenever spring flowers bloomed because they had planted their first roses together. Before dawn each morning, he locked the growing collection inside a carved wooden chest and hid the key beneath a loose stone in the library fireplace. Serafina noticed the exhaustion in his eyes but chose not to question him. Instead, she quietly prepared for a different battle. She searched forgotten medical journals stored in monasteries, consulted retired battlefield surgeons who had witnessed rare poisons during distant wars, and traveled to isolated villages where elderly herbalists guarded knowledge ignored by royal scholars. Weeks of relentless searching yielded little more than fading legends until an elderly monk welcomed her into a mountain sanctuary filled with ancient manuscripts. After carefully studying her medicine samples, he recognized the poison as one nearly erased from history. He explained that only a rare silver blossom growing upon the storm cliffs possessed properties capable of restoring a heart damaged by its effects. The flower bloomed once every 10 years and would vanish within days. Serafina departed before sunrise without revealing the journey's true purpose. She left only a brief note explaining that hope sometimes required difficult roads. The climb toward the storm cliffs proved more dangerous than any tale had described. Narrow paths crumbled beneath her boots, fierce winds threatened every step, and freezing rain transformed jagged rocks into sheets of glass. Hours passed before she finally spotted clusters of pale silver flowers clinging to the cliffside beneath a towering ledge. Reaching them demanded climbing beyond the safety of the marked trail, yet she never hesitated. Every painful step carried the image of Leopold's smile in her heart. Back at the castle, Leopold discovered her note and immediately understood she had gone searching for a cure. Ignoring every warning from his advisors, he mounted his horse and followed the mountain road despite his failing strength. By the time he reached the cliffs, thunder rolled across the darkened sky and rain lashed the rocks with violent force. He called Serafina's name until he spotted her high above, carefully gathering the final blossoms. At that exact moment, the soaked stone beneath her feet fractured. She slipped, desperately catching a narrow ledge before gravity pulled her toward the abyss. Leopold climbed without considering the danger. Every breath burned through his damaged chest, but fear gave him strength beyond reason. Reaching the ledge, he stretched himself across the slick rock until his fingers finally grasped Serafina's trembling hand. Wind roared around them as loose stones disappeared into the endless valley below. Tears mixed with rain upon her face as she cried, "You'll fall if you keep holding me." He smiled despite the pain. "Not before saving you." Drawing upon the last of his strength, Leopold pulled her onto solid ground. They collapsed together beneath the storm, exhausted but alive, the precious flowers still clutched safely in Serafina's hand. Neither spoke for several minutes. The silence carried every fear, every sacrifice, and every unspoken promise they had shared since the night they married. At last she leaned against his shoulder, whispering that she could never bear a future without him. He gently kissed her forehead, grateful that fate had granted them another sunrise together. The monk prepared the antidote using the rare blossoms and instructed Leopold to drink every drop before sunset. Days passed before any change appeared. His breathing steadied slightly, his fever lessened, and the violent coughing grew less frequent. Even so, the physicians remained cautious. The poison had scarred his heart too deeply to promise recovery, and none dared declare him safe. Leopold accepted their uncertainty with quiet gratitude, believing each additional day was already a gift. As the 10th month approached, the castle prepared for what everyone expected would be a final farewell. Leopold completed his last letters, entrusted the future hospital to Serafina's care, and thanked every servant personally for their years of loyalty. On the evening before the physician's predicted deadline, church bells began ringing across the duchy, their solemn echoes drifting through the autumn air. Standing beside the window, Serafina reached for Leopold's hand, refusing to release it as darkness settled over the kingdom and the longest night of their lives quietly began. Dawn arrived beneath a sky veiled in soft gray clouds as church bells continued their mournful toll across the duchy. Villagers gathered outside Kingsley Castle carrying flowers instead of banners, believing they had come to bid farewell to the Duke who had restored their hope. Inside the castle, every servant moved quietly through familiar corridors, unwilling to disturb the heavy silence that hung over the household. Serafina remained beside Leopold's bed, never releasing his hand. They spoke very little because words seemed too fragile for a moment that might become their last together. Leopold looked toward the window where the first light of morning touched the white roses blooming in the gardens below. They had planted those flowers believing neither of them might live long enough to watch them flourish, yet now they stood in full blossom despite the approaching farewell. He smiled gently at Serafina and thanked her for giving meaning to months he had once expected to spend counting the days until death. She refused to answer with tears. Instead, she reminded him that love had never measured life by calendars, only by the courage to cherish every sunrise. Together they waited as the hours quietly slipped past. The royal physicians examined Leopold repeatedly throughout the morning, expecting his weakened heart to surrender at any moment. Instead, they noticed something impossible. His pulse, though still faint, no longer faded with each passing hour. His breathing remained steady, and the painful cough that had haunted him for months never returned. One elderly physician asked to examine him again, convinced exhaustion had clouded his judgment. After several careful moments, he slowly lowered his trembling hands and stared at Leopold in astonishment. "Your Grace," he whispered, "your heartbeat is stronger today than it was yesterday." The room fell silent before astonished joy erupted among everyone present. More physicians arrived to confirm the unexpected change, comparing earlier records with fresh examinations. Each reached the same remarkable conclusion. The poison had finally left Leopold's body. The damage to his heart would require patience and continued care, but the slow death that had shadowed him for years had ended. Serafina closed her eyes in grateful relief as tears streamed freely down her face. Leopold drew her into his arms, both of them understanding that the miracle had been earned through relentless faith, sacrifice, and unwavering devotion rather than chance alone. News of the Duke's recovery spread through the kingdom even faster than the original diagnosis. Church bells that had rung in mourning now celebrated with joyful peals. Villagers filled the roads leading toward the castle, singing songs of thanksgiving while children scattered flower petals across the gates. For the first time in many years, Kingsley Castle echoed with laughter instead of whispered fear. Yet Leopold knew true healing required more than surviving. The people responsible for poisoning him still remained free. Armed with the ledgers, letters, and testimony Serafina had gathered, Leopold presented every piece of evidence before the King's Council. Lord Cedric Ashcombe's web of betrayal unraveled completely. Witnesses confirmed his bribery, his manipulation of royal officials, his theft of public funds, and his role in orchestrating both Leopold's poisoning and the destruction of the Everley family. The king stripped Cedric and his remaining accomplices of every title, estate, and privilege. Their wealth was seized and redirected toward rebuilding neglected villages, expanding hospitals, supporting orphanages, and restoring schools that corruption had allowed to decay. Justice, though delayed, finally reached those who had suffered in silence. Among the recovered royal records lay another forgotten truth. During an old rebellion years before, Serafina's father had secretly saved the king's life by leading the royal family through hidden mountain passes while sacrificing his own estate to delay pursuing enemies. Political turmoil had buried his heroism beneath false accusations crafted by Cedric's allies. Moved by undeniable proof, the king publicly restored the Everley name before the assembled court. Serafina inherited her ancestral lands not as a gift but as a right long denied. She accepted the honor with quiet humility, dedicating the restored estate to farming, healing, and education rather than luxury. Months later, life settled into a peaceful rhythm that neither Leopold nor Serafina had ever dared imagine. The hospital overlooking the river welcomed its first patients, schools filled with eager children, and abandoned villages gradually transformed into thriving communities. Leopold regained strength through daily walks among the gardens, while Serafina balanced her responsibilities as Duchess with caring personally for those too poor to afford treatment elsewhere. Their marriage, once born from necessity, had become the heart of a renewed duchy. One peaceful evening, Serafina invited Leopold into the nursery overlooking the castle gardens. Smiling with unusual nervousness, she placed a tiny pair of knitted baby shoes into his hands. His eyes widened with astonished delight. "Twins?" he asked hopefully. Laughing through happy tears, she shook her head and quietly placed a second and then a third pair beside the first. Leopold stared for a heartbeat before joyful laughter escaped him, brighter than any sound the castle had heard in years. He lifted her into his arms, promising that every story he had nearly left unfinished would now belong to their growing family. 10 years later, the ballroom where despair had first entered their lives shone once more beneath glittering chandeliers. Their 3 lively children chased one another through smiling guests before racing toward the gardens where white roses still bloomed. Leopold, no longer the lonely duke feared throughout the kingdom, extended his hand towards Serafina as musicians began playing the melody they had first danced to as husband and wife. With affectionate laughter in her eyes, she accepted his hand. "The doctor gave me 10 months, he said softly." She smiled, resting her forehead against his. "And God gave us the rest of our lives." As they danced together, the ballroom doors opened, and hundreds of villagers, servants, soldiers, and children whose lives they had touched entered carrying glowing candles. They bowed in silent gratitude, honoring not only the duke who survived death but the couple whose compassion had healed an entire kingdom. Love had never promised them forever, yet by choosing each other every single day, they discovered that forever had quietly chosen them.